It's time for the Your Personal Bank Show with Ference Toth. In an era of chaos, confusion, and craziness, Ference is a voice for common sense. As a financial literacy educator, speaker, and entrepreneur, Ference cuts through the noise to help us understand how current events affect our money, economy, and our freedom. Now, here's Ference Toth.
Welcome to the Your Personal Bank Show. This is Ference. So I always have this dilemma when I'm doing the show because it's a financially focused show, yet current events, politics, so many things happen recently, well, in the last couple of years especially, that do affect our money. I do get often asked, why do I talk about politics so often? Well, again, it affects our money. So many of these government policies do. On the other hand, I get constant feedback from you listeners, which I very much appreciate. They say, I like the financial information, but the reason I keep listening is for your current events and political commentary, and again, how it affects us and our money. So again, I have this dilemma on which I should focus on more versus the other. Well, I have the happy coincidence today of getting to discuss a topic that really encompasses both very well. And this has to do with some of the latest inflation numbers. The Biden administration recently has been touting, we had Thanksgiving recently, and they were touting how inflation is 65% less than when it was and all that. And again, that's a very misleading statement. Most Americans understand that. They understand prices are not lower, and that's why there's been such a huge negative feedback from the White House with these messages about how inflation is lower than it was. If they would be more direct and clarify, I think they would have a lot more positive response rather than trying to hoodwink people and mislead them. I believe it's very misleading, and try to put out this narrative that they want people to believe, but we all pretty much know is not true. Again, the whole idea that inflation is down 65% is only the actual truth is it's still increasing. The prices of goods and services are still increasing. And I'm going to be covering some numbers today that will really bring that to bear. It's just the rate of increase has slowed down. So it's still going up, but it's not going up 65% slower than it was before. That doesn't help anybody. The reality is inflation is still increasing at about double the rate of what the Federal Reserve wants for stable monetary policy. There's nothing good about the news except for the fact it's not going up as fast as it used to go up. Well, that's very small consolation when you really understand inflation, when you have multi-year inflation, which is what we're dealing with now. We're going into our third year now of inflation. And the problem you have is it builds on itself. So if you have, I think it was 4 or 5% inflation in 2021, and then, we saw upwards of 9% in 22, right? And then this year we're seeing falling somewhere around 4. You add all those up, it's about 18% according to the government numbers. Cumulative inflation, that's an increase of 18% for the average price, of any good that you might be purchasing, say, 3 years ago. So in other words, if something was $100 3 years ago, it's now $118. Now, again, the government numbers are also skewed, and that's another reason why people are so angry and frustrated, because when are they going to start treating us like adults? I mean, really, come on. We know better. We go to the store. We go to the gas station. We buy stuff, okay? Most Americans do, at least. And we know what the price of stuff, we know it costs more than it did a year or 2 or 3 ago. That's not rocket science. That's anybody who's paying any kind of attention. That's just a fact. So to try to tell us something that we see obviously right in front of our faces is incredibly insulting and infuriating. And yeah, that's why people are getting so angry about it, as they should. So here's some of the actual facts. So one of the things is the Thanksgiving inflation rate is actually way higher than what the government says. And I have a few statistics to be able to share with you here that really bear that in mind. Here's the real numbers. Your Thanksgiving turkey, for example, why did it feel so expensive? It's 50% higher than it was 5 years ago. So if you think about that, that's about an average of 10% increase per year over the last 5 years. Yes, it went down a little bit this year, 2023 versus 2024. But again, it's still 50% higher than it was just 5 years ago. That's not good. That doesn't feel right. It's going up far faster than incomes, wages, or anything else like that for the vast majority of people. To give you an idea, potatoes went up 23% and Gravies 32% over the last 5 years. Bakery products, stuff like that, are up 30%. When you have those kinds of increases over the past 5 year period, you start to see the reason why. And again, most of that increase was not in 4 and 5 years ago, it was actually in the past 3 years. In fact, almost all of those increases, from 30 to 50% of total increases in prices of turkey and other things with the Thanksgiving meal, have occurred over the past 3 years. No wonder people are frustrated with the Biden administration, because many of their policies, and we've discussed this on the show many times, whether it's energy policy or government spending, have exacerbated and contributed directly to much of this inflation that we're dealing with. Here, give you another idea. It's not just the Thanksgiving meal that has gone up 30 to 50% over the last 3 years. Things like meat and poultry, fish and eggs also are up about 30% than they were 3 years ago. So that is the reason why people are feeling the inflation so much. Here's another one. In 2023, the average American family is now needing $11,000 more just to keep up their standard of living than they were 2 years ago in 2021. That type of increase that rapidly impacts and affects many, many Americans negatively in a big way. Like they're saying, less than half of Americans are now stating that they can live comfortably, or about half, I should say, cannot live comfortably and have little money left over after meeting their expenses. The main costs that are causing these inflationary things, and this is not anything that, that's what's going on in America today, that about half Americans are having a hard time making their basic expenses, and those are food, transportation, housing, and energy. Those are the top categories. And about 80 cents of every dollar in extra spending is going to just those four things: food, transportation, housing, and energy. People aren't spending it on extravagant stuff. It's the basics, the basic living expenses that so many people are dealing with. The income needed. Now, here's the other part of it that's a lot of people don't realize. Yes, the extra expenses were $11,000 more than they were 2 years ago for the average American household. The problem is, it's not just that you need another $11,000 to cover the extra cost for the basic living expenses. The average increase in income has to be $14,000. Why? Taxes, folks. The average American, if they earn an extra $14,000 in income, they have to pay a certain amount of that in taxes, which they'll have $11,000 left over to pay for the extra costs, inflationary costs of food and housing and transportation and such. Most American households have not increased their income in the last 2 years by $14,000. That's why 6 in 10 of Americans are failing today to meet their basic needs. These are according to the government numbers and government statistics. When you have 60% of Americans not able to actually make their basic expenses, that is dire economic circumstances, especially as it continues to go on. So in other words, the longer this drags on, this inflation cycle, where the prices of things continue to increase, even if it's at a slower rate, the more this is going to pinch the budgets of the typical American household. And that's going to have devastating consequences for our economy across the board, folks. If fewer people have money to spend, heard this so many times, about 2/3 of the gross domestic product, GDP, is consumer spending. If 60% of Americans are failing to make their basic needs, consumer spending will be reduced. Here's a little bit more to help you understand this situation better. See, the average hourly wage over the last couple of years has increased 13%. That's one of the things the Biden administration touts, how wages have increased. But that's far outpaced by the average inflation spike, which is, according to the government numbers, 18%. But if you're dealing with many of the food items that the typical American household purchases, is more like 30%. increases over the last 2-3 years. So that's what I'm trying to help people understand is, yes, inflation rate is slowed. The rate of increase, I should say, has slowed, but it's still increasing. And those increases are on top of the high inflation, the generationally high inflation we had last year, and some inflation we had the year before, far higher than normal. It's the stacking effect. It's the combination of putting these multiple years of inflation on top of each other. That's where it's really hurting people in a big, big way. Another key point about this too is the Alliance for Consumers estimated the Biden administration rules and regulations have now forced about a $9,000 price tag on American homeowners. And this is due to price hikes related to cars, washing machines, gas stoves, and dishwashers, whether they're buying a new one or fixing a stove or whatever it may be. The extra costs are adding to the inflationary problem. And that's why some of the latest studies are stating around 75% of all Americans are describing the economy as poor. Now, what can you do about this? And I'm going to discuss this throughout today's show, because so many times in the show I'll discuss some of the challenges or what's going on to bring you up to date, educate you on what's going on, and then at the end try to cover some of the solutions. I'm going to try to intersperse it more today, because I know people don't always get the chance to listen to the entire show, so they're going to hear bits and pieces of it. Well, you have to make your money go farther. That's one of those big solutions. I mean, you really have a couple of choices. You can earn more, spend less, or make your money. The third option is make your money go farther. Earning more, I'm sure there's a lot of people that have done things like taking on extra jobs, extra work, expand their business, whatever. Spending less can be difficult. How do you downsize a home now when it's hard to buy a new home with the high interest rates, and a lot of people are stuck? I'm going to discuss some of that more probably in the next segment. Making your money grow farther is one of those areas that most people haven't addressed, and your personal bank can help you with that. It's called positive arbitrage, or positive cash flow on your money. In other words, if you can earn interest on money you spent, you would actually have more money to spend each and every year going forward for the rest of your life. Your personal bank allows you to do that. By making your money go further, you have more of it, and that's imperative, especially when we're dealing with high inflation. I'm going to discuss this further because I'm coming up on a hard break here. I'm going to discuss this further in the next segment, I promise. So I'm really going to encourage you to stay tuned.
Stay tuned for more common sense from Ference. For more information, contact Ference at 866-268-4422 or yourpersonalbank.com. That's 866-268-4422. Welcome back to the Your Personal Bank Show with Ference Toth. Want more information? Contact Ference at 866-268-4422 or yourpersonalbank.com. That's 866-268-4422. Now back to the show with Ference Toth.
Welcome back to the Your Personal Bank Show. This is Ference. So I was discussing in the previous segment how the cumulative effect of inflation is what's so devastating. I've brought this up a number of times. The Biden administration, particularly around Thanksgiving holidays, was discussing how this Thanksgiving meal was cheaper than it's been in many other years, and compared to the cost of or wages or whatever. Inflation's coming down 65%. Again, the rate of increase has slowed down, but it's still increasing. And as I stated, most of the items that the typical household purchases over the last 3 years has increased anywhere from 30 to 50%. Most of that is food, transportation, housing, the basics, the stuff energy, the things that people need to live on a daily basis. The other thing is in 2022, you have to now make $14,000 more income. That's the typical household, that is. Maintain the same standard of living or pay the same bills, because the cost of things have increased by $11,000 for the average household, inflation-wise. But you have to make $14,000 of income because you got to pay some of that in taxes, right, to have the $11,000 left over. So how many households have increased their income by $14,000 in the past year? Most have not. That's the statistical fact. That's why 60% of Americans, the financial situation is worse than it was. 75% of Americans believe the economy is poor. And I've seen some financial studies showing 86% of Americans are actually worse off financially than they were 2-3 years ago. Those are the actual numbers statistically. It goes on. I mean, it goes on to even things like travel, again, are more expensive than they were before. It's not just even the basic household expenses, but if you were going to buy gifts, they're more expensive than they were a couple of years ago. Again, we're seeing anywhere from 20 to 30%, depending on what you're looking at. It doesn't seem to matter. There's very few things out there, whether it's a gallon of milk or a computer, that it doesn't seem like it's more expensive than it was. There's so many things that it encompasses. There's very few things that are outside of it. And that's why, interestingly, it's this article says bad omen for Biden, because most Democratic voters are now unhappy with the economy. In fact, the latest study, 62% of Democrat voters are rating the economy as fair to poor. And what's interesting is one of the things that Biden had promised to do in his inaugural address was that he was going to, bring America together, or whatever it was, right? Which, of course, obviously he didn't do that day one. But in a rare agreement among Americans, it's millennials, Gen X, Republicans, and Democrats all agree now the economy sucks. That's about 70% of Americans in this study discuss how the economy just sucks. It's not a good thing. We have a slow economy. We have high inflation, have high interest rates. There's just a lot of things going on that make this not a good situation. And wages, yes, have increased to a degree, but not anywhere near as much as inflation has. Again, according to the government numbers, wages have increased about 13% over the last 3 years, while inflation on most items that the average household purchases, food, transportation, energy, those types of things, housing, have increased about 30% in that same time frame. Those numbers don't add up. You have to make another $14,000 a year per household just to cover the same expenses you did a year ago, because you need 11,000 more, and you have to pay taxes on the 14, right? Things like, here's another one, even not only housing costs are some of the biggest ones, childcare is expensive, all right? All these things, doesn't seem to matter where you go, like I said. And then with student loan payments now resuming, that's just another bill people have to juggle. And that's why, interestingly, Biden's approval rating is stuck in the high 30s, because they're rating the handling of the economy worse than Trump's. In fact, one of the latest studies showing that on Trump versus Biden on economic issues is Trump is about 60%, while Biden is in the high 30s. I mean, it's not quite double, but pretty close. The fact is, and I've seen some other studies from some very credible sources and institutes, even some of them that they're not conservative by any means, have had to admit that the Trump economy was far better than Biden's for a number of reasons. Real incomes have dropped with Biden, okay, around 1%. With Trump, they were up 3%. Those are just statistical facts. You look at these numbers and you see these charts, and just one after another, you have a White House, you have an administration trying to tell you how great things are. When you go to the grocery store or the gas station, that it's not. It's like, do you believe your lying eyes or don't you? And the facts, of course, bear that out. Another ugly trend that's occurring is many Americans are now pulling cash from their retirement savings just to pay their bills and maintain their basic expenses. The number of people taking hardship withdrawals from IRAs and 401ks is double what it was even a year or two ago. As prices continue to increase, even at a slower rate of increase, but still continue to increase, this will cause more and more people to pinch their budget, so they won't be able to cover their bills, cover their expenses. And again, how does this affect the economy and investments and all that? If we don't see a significant change in direction in price increases, if this continues to go on, even at slower rates, but continues to increase, it's going to pinch more and more American households. They're already pinching many of them. There's, as I stated in the last segment, roughly half of Americans are not having any money left over after paying the bills month to month. As this continues, 2/3 of the gross domestic product, 2/3 of the economy is consumer spending. As consumers are pinched, they're going to be spending less and less of it. They'll have less money available to spend to continue the economy going. I don't know what's going to happen for sure, but major changes need to occur. Otherwise, the direction that we're going is obvious. It's abundantly obvious. And the direction is not good and it's not pretty. And I'm not going to discuss it a lot today because I've really hit this hard in the last couple of shows. And if you missed it, I'm going to encourage you to go to yourpersonalbank.com. You can listen to this or any of the previously recorded shows, by the way. But I've been discussing how the government debt, and more importantly, the interest on the debt, the fact that it's doubled in the last 19 months. And our federal government is now spending over $1 trillion a year just on interest on the debt. And they last year brought in $4.4 trillion in tax revenues. What that means, folks, is the government is spending about a quarter of its income just on interest. And that the amount it's paying on interest has doubled in the last 19 months. Look at your own financial situation, your own household, your own business. The interest you had to pay doubled in the last couple of years. What would your financial position look like? It would be getting really ugly. And by the way, the amount of interest now, because of the higher interest rates and everything else that's going on, and the higher amount of debt, they're both compounding on each other and creating what's called a debt spiral. And a debt spiral is a very, very bad thing. It means that interest on the debt, the amount of interest they have to pay, continues to accelerate. So this isn't going down. It's going up, and it's going up at a faster and faster rate. This is also ugly for the economy. This is not a good sign. I want to get into a whole lot of it, but my point is there's a lot of things coming down the pike that are not pretty from an economic standpoint, and we as a country and we as individuals have to start really looking at change in direction on what we're doing. The government cannot continue to spend the kind of money it is going to have to cut back. It's going to be forced to. If it doesn't do it itself, it's going to be forced to at some point in the near future. Consumers are already getting squeezed, so the economy is going to get squeezed more and more if consumers cannot keep going. If they don't buy things, businesses aren't going to be able to make them and sell them, are they? It's going to have a real detrimental effect, and I believe we're sooner to that now, much sooner to that than we were, well, many people believe. And I said I've shared this. I've had a theory on this very topic, which I'm going to discuss in the next segment because I found it interesting how Jamie Dimon, CEO of Chase Bank, which is the largest bank in the country, pretty much echoed this theory that I've been sharing for the last several months. I thought it was quite interesting on why our economy has not gone into recession yet, but he fully expects it to do so. But before I get there, because I'm going to touch that on the next segment, again, solutions. I started to discuss in the last segment how you need to look at getting your money to go farther. You know, one of those ways is to get positive arbitrage on your money so that you can earn interest on the money that you spend. If you grow your money in your personal bank policy, you grow the cash in the policy, then you access it through a bank line. As long as you're earning more in interest, more in dividends, I should say, then you're getting charged in interest, you get to keep the difference. And even if it's 1%, to be super conservative, again, the historical average of positive cash flow on the money with these personal bank policies has been 2 to 3% over the last 40 plus years. Interest rates have gone up. Dividends are on the rise. They'll be on the rise for the next number of years because dividends are highly interest rate sensitive. So you have an asset that's growing, increasing rate of return in a tough economy. This is exciting. It's insured, has guarantees, and is tax-free with high liquidity. If you can get some positive arbitrage, if you can earn some interest on some money that you've spent, it means by definition, you will have more money. Mathematically, you will have more money to spend each and every year going forward for the rest of your life. That's how positive cash flow works. And most people, most Americans are not receiving any positive cash flow on their money they're spending. In other words, they earn money, they pay all their bills, and hopefully some's left over and they use that to invest for the future or whatever. But that flow of money that's coming in and then going out, they're not gaining any benefit from that. Yet banks do that every day of the week. Banks take money in through deposits, then loan it out for loans, and they earn interest on that loans. And then they also pay interest to the depositors. Obviously, banks typically charge more in interest on home loans, car loans, whatever, than the interest they pay to depositors. That's the spread or the difference or the arbitrage or the positive cash flow for the bank. Banks do this every day of the week, and they've been doing it for centuries. That's why I call it your personal bank. You can operate like a bank with your money. You can put your money into an account that grows. Look, if you leave it there and let it, that's one question I get all the time. If I leave it there, will it grow? Yeah, you earn dividends. Like I said, insured with guarantees, tax-free. There's nothing wrong with that. High liquidity. If and when you need that money, you can then access it day one, anywhere from 60 to 90% typically. You can access that money and use it to pay bills if that's what you need, or to buy an item or invest. But again, if you're earning more in dividends and you get charged in interest, you're getting to keep the difference, which means you could put money into a personal bank policy, access it through a bank line or whatever, pay the bills, and still be earning some interest on that money you use to pay the bills. Look, if you can show me another way of doing it, I'm all ears. I'm totally open. I would love to hear from you. You can reach out to me at yourpersonalbank.com. Reach out my email, ference@yourpersonalbank.com. It's FERENC @yourpersonalbank.com. If you want more information or have questions, feel free to email me. My point is simple. With higher inflation, higher expenses, higher costs of living, and all those things, your money needs to go farther if you're going to make it, if you're going to thrive through this type of environment. So if you can earn some interest on your money you're spent, all the better. It means you'll have more money. Stay tuned in the next segment. I'm going to share my theory of why. I've shared this before, but Jamie Dimon echoed that, why the economy has not gone into a recession yet, but yet he does fully expect it to do so. Stay tuned.
Stay tuned for more common sense from Ference. For more information, contact Ference at 866-268-4422 or yourpersonalbank.com. That's 866-268-4422. Welcome back to the Your Personal Bank Show with Ference Toth. Want more information? Contact Ference at 866-268-4422 or yourpersonalbank.com. That's 866-268-4422. Now back to the show with Ference Toth.
Welcome back to the Your Personal Bank Show. This is Ference. So I've been discussing a number of things where the economy, interest rates, the inflation has really been eating into the American consumer, and it's really starting to hurt them big time. I have one more point, and then I'll get into this, my theory about why the recession has not occurred already, and that is the consumer. See, the consumer has been buying, and these two thoughts I was sharing with you do tie in together. The consumer has been the lone bright spot in terms of the economy and why things are continuing to have not gone into recession yet. But as many indicators and many are starting to say in the business world and economists, the consumer slowdown has begun. I'm going to share with you why it has, why it continued as long as it has. But it has begun. For example, first of all, retail sales are falling. That's just a fact. If you look at the numbers over the last several quarters, they are starting, or last several months, we're starting to see a real slowdown in overall retail sales. And Walmart, for example, came out strongly stating the same type of thing. Consumers were spending in 2023 in a big way. There were two big reasons behind that. One, they still had monies left over in savings from the COVID shutdowns, the COVID stimulus money was put into the system, and it just still takes time for that to percolate through and get out of the system. Secondly, with the higher inflation, if you were thinking about purchasing something and you had the money to do so, you knew it's probably going to be more expensive in the future because inflation, that causes a lot of people to then go ahead and pull the trigger and buy that item, particularly bigger ticket items. So consumer spending was actually up big in 2023 compared to most years. If you waited, it was probably going to cost more. So if you're thinking about buying that car because you're going to need one soon anyway, let's say, you might have gone ahead and done it because you knew if you waited, it's probably going to be higher next year. That's a great example of that. But we are starting to see that slowdown because people did that buying, and they're also starting to run out of those savings. Many predictions have shown the average American who had excess savings, largely because of the COVID stimulus, has now used up most, if not all, of that savings. The majority have, the median, if you will. Another thing is spending intentions have plummeted. In other words, they track these kinds of things in terms of what do consumers intend to purchase, over the next month or so. Actually, the readings on those are some of the lowest numbers we've seen in 2 years. Not only have folks spent the money that they were thinking about buying something and bought it because if they waited, it was going to cost more because of inflation, but now, and they've used up a lot of those excess dollars and savings or whatnot, now they're intending to spend less. They just are. So that's a big plunge from even just a few months ago. The other one is people are starting to really trim their grocery bills. As I stated in the first couple of segments, many of the staples that people buy in the grocery store over the last 2 or 3 years have increased by 30%. That's a total increase in cost of many goods and many of the foods that people buy. Well, they're starting to buy less, or they're starting to buy more frugal items. They're spending less, in other words, in the grocery store because the cost is just getting too much too quick. Their incomes haven't kept up with the rise in prices. It's just that simple. The fourth one is financial health is weakening. This kind of goes back to my point is the savings that people had, much of it excess savings due to the COVID shutdowns and stimulus. It was either a combination of things. With the shutdowns, maybe they didn't go out as much because restaurants weren't open or whatever, or movie theaters or whatever it is they would have done normally. They just stayed home more, so they actually spent less money. Or they might have, through one method or another, I've shared these before, received some stimulus monies, either directly or indirectly, from the government. Either way, they had more money in their pocket, and they ended up with more savings. Well, that is changing. In fact, the numbers are starting to go down in terms of financial well-being, and it's dropping precipitously. These are not good gauges in terms of the consumer shutting down. Now, let me go to this article with Jamie Dimon, CEO of Chase Bank. He's highly respected in the financial industry. He tends to kind of tell it more straight than most. So I kind of like a lot of the stuff he says with things. But he's been stating, and he kind of echoed theory that I've been sharing now for quite some time, for a number of months. I've been stating that most economists and experts were looking at a recession in 2023. Clearly didn't happen. And the reason, my theory was, well, again, there was so much money pumped into the system, so much stimulus from the government pumped into the system, that it was just going to take some time to percolate that out of the system. And now we're starting, I believe, to see. Jamie Dimon stated it something along, he says, the economy, looking at the current economy, things look pretty good. It's kind of like we've had, as he stated, a bit of drugs injected into our system called fiscal stimulation. And as he stated, it's the largest we've ever seen in peacetime, with quantitative easing and the largest monetary stimulation and effects. But he says, like drugs running through the system, they create a sugar high. He says, we've had this sugar high, but of course, that runs out. We all know what happens after a sugar high, that you get a sugar crash. Like he said, these corporate profits are up. Of course they're up because people are spending a lot of money. He stated, where did they get the money? The government gave it to them. So, of course, profits are up. He goes, but I'm really cautious now. And I'd be very careful about that because everybody's feeling pretty good today, but that's running out, as I've been stating in these previous segments about the consumer spending is definitely weakening. He's just stating very much, and he said he believes that a recession, we're looking at one in 2024. That's probably correct. We're going to see. The leading economic indicators are continuing to point to that very thing. We've had unprecedented government interference, if you will, in my opinion, in our economic system. Again, all this economic stimulus, all this quantitative easing, low interest environment, easy money, easy monetary policy, easy to borrow money, easy to grow, easy to, buy real estate, invest. It's easy for businesses to grow and expand and create more profit and all that. And then when the COVID shutdowns happened, then the government, helicoptered money into the system. Like Jamie Dimon said, it's like drugs in the system, like getting a sugar rush. All those things happen because our government decided to make those things happen because, well, there's a lot of reasons behind it, but it's good for politicians, they think. So they put all this into the system. But those kind of things don't last forever. When you have a sugar rush, you have a sugar crash. That's just how things happen. And all I'm saying is things may have been really good. You may feel pretty good about it, but you might want to consider proceeding with caution. Again, I don't know exactly when that's going to happen, when things are going to change, but it certainly appears from every economic indicator to just about every economist or business leader you talk to, they're all calling for this, just about all of them calling for the same thing. We're going to see a significant change in the economy. This economy likely is not going to grow and expand without dramatic changes. Let's put it this way, without any significant dramatic changes like we saw the last decade. The next decade is going to look a lot tougher. Assets, asset growth, things like stocks, real estate, all that. As you've heard me share on this show so many times, assets that thrived in the past decade are highly unlikely to thrive. Well, they're going to struggle in the next decade, most likely, because the economy has changed so much. Debt, interest rates, inflation, all of those things have changed dramatically from a decade or so ago. Thrived, we know what thrived in the last decade. The things that struggled didn't do so well. Fixed things, guaranteed, dividend-paying assets. They didn't do so well. They just didn't thrive in that environment. Well, now they're starting to shine. Most experts predict they're going to continue. Higher interest rates alone are going to cause dividends to be higher. Interest rates at banks are higher. We've seen that. I've discussed that many times. Your personal bank dividends are on the rise. We're fully expecting increases to be occurring for the next number of years. I wouldn't be surprised to see it for the next 3 to 5 years, if not longer. And that's assuming the Federal Reserve does no further interest rate rising any further. So if they stop raising rates, we should see raising dividend rates for the next 3 to 5 years, if not longer. Because if nothing else, the bonds that they're purchasing and the interest rates they're receiving on those bonds, or the profits that these companies making, is far higher than it was a year or two ago. Do you really believe we're going to go back to the 3% 30-year fixed mortgage environment? I mean, that was really once in a lifetime scenario. Most likely, we'll probably never see it again. During that really low interest rate environment, the interest rates bonds were making was very low. The profits for insurance companies, for example, and dividend-paying companies and banks and all that was extremely low. Historical lows. In fact, we saw the lowest interest rate environment we saw in the history of this country for the longest period of time. That's a statistical fact. And now all that has changed. And that's the thing I'm really trying to express with people and trying to help them understand. If there was a time to diversify, start to change your investment strategy, start to create some diversification. If there was ever a time to do so, the time is now. The economy has changed. The direction we're headed and the growth we're seeing and what's going to grow is different. It's changed. You either change with it or, like the dinosaurs, you get taken out. Change, adapt, or die. That is the bottom line. What worked in the last decade, highly unlikely to work in the next decade. The two big red flags I see, the two big risks I see, is higher interest rates. It's almost certain we're going to see a higher interest rate environment in the next decade than we saw in the past decade. Again, it was the lowest interest rate decade in the history of the country. What are the odds of that happening again? Statistically, almost zero. So it's going to be higher than it was before, and obviously we're looking at higher rates for longer. That's what almost everyone is saying, including the Federal Reserve. That means dividends are going to be higher. Like I said, personal bank dividends are going to keep rising. You can put your money in here, let it grow. It'll be safe, guaranteed, with guarantees, tax-free. And that's the other big risk I see. As an interest, as I stated in the last segment, I've been sharing in the last shows. And if you missed it, go to yourpersonalbank.com. You can listen to this or any of the previously recorded shows. The interest on the debt has more than doubled in the last 19 months for the federal government. That in itself will force interest rates to be higher. The benefit, how can you win? Dividends will be higher with your personal bank policies. You'll get higher rates of return. Stay tuned to the next segment. I'm going to finish up with some thoughts I don't think you want to miss.
Stay tuned for more common sense from Ferens. For more information, contact Ferens at 866-268-4422 or yourpersonalbank.com. That's 866-268-4422. Welcome back to the Your Personal Bank Show with Ference Toth. Want more information? Contact Ference at 866-268-4422 or yourpersonalbank.com. That's 866-268-4422. Now back to the show with Ference Toth.
Welcome back to the Your Personal Bank Show. This is Ference. And in the last segment, I was just discussing some of the theories that I had. And, of course, Jamie Dimon, CEO of Chase Bank, kind of echoed is with the government putting so much stimulus into the system with the COVID stimulus, it was like a sugar high. So the economy is run hotter, and the consumer spending in particular is run stronger than normal, than what you would expect, and that's why there's been a delay in this recession. Because I'm hearing that from some places. It's like, well, so many of the economists and everybody was predicting, and some of the economic indicators were predicting a recession in 2023, and it really didn't happen. Why? Again, consumer spending ran really strong because there was so much extra savings, so much extra money people still had from the COVID stimulus. Unprecedented levels in peacetime. We've never seen anything like it. Also, a lot of people decided to make purchases this year because they saw generational high inflation. And if they were planning to buy something, you'd rather buy it now than wait because you know it'd probably be more expensive in the future if you waited. So we saw an excess amount of spending, and that's starting to wane away, the consumer spending. So things are changing, folks. It's changing. It's just taking longer than we expected because of those reasons. Unfortunately, I do not hope this happens, but my opinion is it's probably likely to it's shaping up more and more. Typically, when you have a bubble, of course, the bubble tends to burst. The bigger the bubble, the longer the bubble, the harder the bubble tends to burst. Unfortunately, again, I don't wish this, but unfortunately, I believe we're probably going to see a stronger recession, a bigger bubble burst, if you will, because of the delay. That's what usually happens. We will see. But I got a few other things I want to share or discuss that I think are very important. And this is just a couple of these things are super frustrating, and then I'll share a little bit of good news at the end. So leave it on a positive note. But one of them is the cost of the taxpayers for supporting illegal aliens. Understand, these are illegals. These are people that have broken the law, which means by definition they are criminals. So they're not undocumented or anything like that. They're criminals. They broke the law. They're illegal criminals. Well, the costs that the U.S. taxpayers are now paying just to house and support these illegal illegals, is over $450 billion per year. Now, this is money we can ill afford to spend because we already have a $33 trillion debt. We're already spending $1.7 trillion as of last year, more than the government receives. We don't need to be spending another $450 billion on illegals. They need to be deported and eliminate that cost. They don't belong here anyway. Why should we, as citizens, have to pay for somebody who's here illegally? That is wrong. That defies the rule of law. And that's incredibly, incredibly frustrating to anyone who pays their taxes, because we see some of our money going out to pay for criminals. And that's what it is. Now, give you an idea of how much money that is. That's about twice the budget, I believe, of the state of Florida. That is not a small amount of money. We could run a couple of large states on the kind of money we're paying for illegals who have broke the law and criminals here. They don't belong. Deport them. And frankly, in my opinion, not only they should be deported, but they should not be allowed to return to the country to come legally for an extended period of time because they broke the law. They jumped the line from people who are trying to come here legally, like my dad. I'm first generation. I feel very strongly about this. And I wish more people, I know a lot of people feel strongly about it, but I wish our leaders in Washington would feel equally as strong. That would be a great thing. But let me give you another thing that's going on. This is kind of an interesting social and financial issue that's come out because of our current economy and the state of the real estate market. So it turns out there's turning out to be some very difficult housing forces happening. Apparently, there's more and more now divorced couples who are still living together because they cannot afford to sell their house and split it up and divorce. Apparently, there's more and more of these folks who bought their homes. Like there's an example of these folks who bought their home in summer of 2022. In fact, in Mesa, Arizona, right near me, and they paid $600,000 for it with a 5.6% mortgage because apparently they didn't have the best credit at the time, although rates were starting to go up. So it was a pretty decent rate at that point. Well, anyway, the bottom line is the house is worth less today than it was when they bought it. Okay, and anybody that bought in the last year or so is experiencing that. Also, if they were to try to sell it and buy something else, they're going to be forcing an even higher interest rate mortgage than what they have now. So they would have to sell at a loss and then each have to buy something else, probably downsizing, obviously. But the bottom line is paying a whole lot more interest on those new properties. So they're stuck living in the same home, even though they're divorced. Apparently, in this type of situation and others where it's difficult living situations are becoming more and more common. And by the way, the idea of going to rent doesn't help either because rent expenses have gone up significantly over the last 2-3 years also. It's been one of the biggest increases. So the housing situation, the difficult housing situation is causing some very difficult situations in people's lives. It's going to be interesting how these things play out. Obviously, some of these are going to become untenable eventually, and then they'll be forced, just because out of sheer emotional reasons, forced to sell, and that's going to hit them hard negatively, obviously, financially too. But here's another one where I find extremely frustrating, where a government is overextending itself in impacting or negatively impacting the economy or businesses or individuals. So apparently recently, 3,700 U.S. auto dealers have pushed Biden to scrap the unrealistic EV mandate. For the reason is because of the low demand, even with all the incentives. I've shared on the show a number of times where I'm not against green energy. I'm against the government forcing green energy down people's throats. Make it competitive. Make it comes a competitive consumer thing. It will grow. It will go. That's how things work. The government is a terrible dictator or controller of economic forces. They tend to mess things up every time they go somewhere. I believe, I don't quote me on these numbers. I've shared this in previous shows, but last year Ford lost something like $60,000 per EV car it sold. That was even with all the incentives, and there's been billions and billions of dollars put into incentives for companies to build EVs, for consumers to buy EVs. I mean, it's ridiculous, the amount of money that's gone into all this. Despite all this, the demand is really poor. Like one of the car dealers was pointing out, look, if somebody wants to come in and buy an EV, we happily sell it to them. There's no issue there. But they said, we can't sell them even with deep price cuts, manufacturer incentives, and generous government incentives. People are just not willing to buy. And they're quoting several reasons. One, the higher cost up front. Again, we have higher inflation and more Americans are getting strapped for money. They don't have the extra 60 grand laying around or 30 grand laying around, whatever it is, to buy an EV. And then secondly, the practicality of it. Unless you live in a certain, some major cities that have a lot of charging stations, most of the country doesn't. So it's just not very practical of a vehicle yet. And I like what this point they make. No president. This is the letter from the car dealers, and I echo the sentiment 100%. No president, no government agency, no think tank, and no polling firm knows more about the automobile customer than us, the automobile dealers. Some customers are in the market for electric vehicles, and we are thrilled to sell them. But the majority of consumers are simply not ready to make the change. The government forcing the consumers, forcing this stuff down their throats, people are just going to hang on to their cars longer. They're going to, because one, they either can't afford it or they don't want to do that. They're going to force many of these dealers out of business. That's what's if they keep pushing these mandates the way that they are. He's pushing a mandate right now that 2 out of every 3 new cars sold in the United States by 2032 will be electric. 2/3 of the cars sold in the United States 9 years from now will be electric. I mean, for one, that's just untenable. The grid, the grid has no capability of managing anything like that. Some of the statistics I've seen, the amount of electric cars consumers out there is something like 2 to 5%, I believe, something in that line. And you go tenfold that many more, and there's already not enough charge stations. I mean, it just doesn't work. Plus, if you put all those charging stations in there, where are you going to get all the electricity output to give the electricity needed for the power stations? It doesn't exist. You got to build power plants or nuclear plants or something to build the infrastructure for the electricity. It doesn't exist. It's not there yet. And you just can't push these cars and then expect magically somehow that you're going to have the energy to power these cars. Now, again, I don't think they really care. The government has ulterior motives. There's other agendas. They don't really want people driving, in my opinion. A little bit of good news. Some of you may remember from a year or so ago that the IRS came out. They were coming out with this threshold that you would have to report any income over $600 to the IRS in 2023, which is a ridiculous amount. They're just trying to catch more people, get more taxes, crack down on people evading taxes, as they put it. So in other words, if you sold something on eBay or something for over $600, you were supposed to report it as part of your income, of course, and you would end up paying taxes on it. People who got tips and all those types of stuff would, of course, be affected by this. Well, they increased the reporting threshold because there was so much pushback on it, and the IRS just can't handle it, frankly, to $5,000. Frankly, I think that's way still too low, but it's better than $600. So it's a win, a small win, I'll say that much. So the reporting limit for 2023, outside income, that type of thing, third-party payment apps, that'd be like Square and those kinds of things. If you do garage sale stuff or whatever it may be, now is $5,000 for 2024, I guess it is. I'm sorry. So again, a small win. If you want to learn how to thrive through this economic situation, higher interest rates, economy that's probably likely going to be slowing down in the near future, learn how to thrive going forward over the next several years, reduce your taxes, reduce your market risk, increase your rate of return, get positive cash flow on your money. Why not earn interest on money you spent? You can do that with Your Personal Bank. Contact me at yourpersonalbank.com or 866-268-4422. You can also email me if you have questions at ference@yourpersonalbank.com. That's FERENC @yourpersonalbank.com. As always, stay tuned to next week. So some more great information. And as long as it's on our money, in God we trust.
Listen Tuesdays at noon and Saturdays at 1 to the Your Personal Bank Show for more information. Contact Ference at 866-268-4422 or yourpersonalbank.com. That's 866-268-4422. This show is designed to provide accurate and authoritative information. The presenter and guests of this program do not engage in legal, accounting, or tax advice. Professional advice regarding your situation should be sought if required. Some products discussed may have limitations and not be available in all states. Excessive unpaid loans may affect performance. Distributions may become taxable if not managed properly. Replacements may not be suitable for everyone. There may be charges when replacing coverage. Dividend rates and bank line of credit rates may change. For current rates, contact Ference at 866-268-4422 or yourpersonalbank.com. Again, that's 866-268-4422 or yourpersonalbank.com.